The Laboo toy Peppa found a strange toy in an old chest in the attic. A small figure with big dark eyes and a wide smile. It had a tag, Laboo. The toy was soft but cold to the touch, as if it had been kept in a freezer for a long time. "Can I take it to my room?" Peppa asked Mummy Pig. "Of course, dear. But wash it first, it's very dusty." Peppa took Laboo to her room and placed it on the shelf next to her other toys. The toy stared straight ahead with an unmoving gaze. Something about its smile seemed wrong, too wide for such a small face. At night, Peppa woke up to a strange sound, quiet rustling, as if someone was crawling on the floor. She turned on the nightlight and looked around the room. Everything was in its place, but Laboo had disappeared from the shelf. "Where is it?" Peppa muttered, getting out of bed. She found the toy under the bed, lying on its side. Strange! How could it have gotten there? Peppa picked up Laboo and put it back on the shelf. The toy seemed heavier than before, and its smile had become even wider. The next day, Peppa was playing with George in the living room. Suddenly, she heard the patter of little feet upstairs. "Mummy, someone's walking in my room," Peppa said. "There's no one there, dear. Maybe it's mice." But when Peppa went up to her room, Laboo was not on the shelf again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the room, turned toward the door. Its pose was as if it had been waiting for Peppa. "How did you get here?" Peppa whispered, carefully approaching the toy. Laboo was silent, but its eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. The girl quickly grabbed the toy and put it back on the shelf, but this time turned it to face the wall. At night, the rustling repeated, but now it was louder. Peppa woke up and saw that Laboo was standing by her bed, looking straight at her. In the darkness, its eyes glowed with a faint greenish light. "What do you want from me?" Peppa whispered, not daring to move. The toy didn't answer, but slowly raised one hand, as if it wanted to touch Peppa. The girl screamed and turned on the light. Laboo instantly became an ordinary toy lying on the floor. "Mummy! Daddy! What happened?" asked Mummy Pig, running into the room. "Laboo! It was moving! It was standing by my bed! It's just a toy, dear. It can't move." But Peppa saw the truth in Laboo's dark eyes. The next day, she tried to throw the toy away, but it kept returning to her room. First in the trash can, then in the garden, even when Peppa took it to the neighbors. Laboo always found its way back. It began appearing in the most unexpected places. In Peppa's school bag, in the refrigerator, even in the bathroom. Each time its smile became wider and its eyes brighter. One night, Peppa woke up and found that all her toys had lined up in a row, looking at the bed. And in the center stood Laboo, like a commander of an army. "Now you understand," whispered a voice that seemed to come from all the toys at once. "I'm not just a toy, I'm a collector. And now, you're part of my collection." Peppa wanted to scream but couldn't move. Her body was becoming stiffer, like a toy. She felt her skin turning to plastic and her thoughts slowing down. "Don't worry," said Laboo, coming closer. "Being a toy isn't so bad. You'll play forever. With me." In the morning, Mummy Pig found a new toy in Peppa's room, very similar to her daughter. It stood on the shelf next to Laboo, with the same wide smile and motionless gaze. "Strange, I don't remember buying this toy," Mummy Pig muttered, adjusting the little dress of the toy Peppa, and Laboo stood nearby, its smile even wider. Now it had a friend, forever. But Laboo's collection wasn't complete yet. In the evening, it heard George playing in the next room. It was time to find a new friend. Peppa woke up in complete darkness. No sound, no glimmer of light, as if the world had vanished. She looked around, but George wasn't there. The house was silent, and even the walls felt unfamiliar. Peppa's hoof touched George's toy dinosaur on the floor, but George himself seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The window, which usually opened onto the garden and street, now showed only a black void, dense and bottomless. She carefully approached the door. The floorboards creaked too loudly, though she could usually walk without a sound. Her heart pounded, her breath grew unsteady. When she stepped into the hallway, it felt as if something in the dark was watching her. The walls seemed alive. Strange shadows rippled across their surface, shadows that shouldn't have been there. "George!" Peppa called, but the only reply was her own voice echoing back at her, as if the house had too many empty rooms. She took a few steps toward the stairs, and just then, the lamp above her flickered. Light flared, then instantly died. But in that moment, Peppa saw a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, distorted, as though stretched out of the darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and from its mouth came a strange, low sound, an echoing, broken melody. "Tongue! Tongue! Saha!" the figure hissed. Peppa froze. Her legs felt rooted to the floor. Her heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. The creature lifted its hand and stepped forward. The floor groaned beneath it, but the footsteps sounded as if they came from several places at once. Peppa instinctively closed her eyes and pressed her ears with her hooves, but the melody only grew louder. She could hear it inside her head now, along with a whisper. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button below the video, or he'll come for you too." Peppa opened her eyes and screamed. The creature was closer now. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face was too long, its mouth stretched too wide, and its eyes burned brighter and brighter red. She backed away, but the hallway grew longer. Each step didn't bring her closer to her room, but instead dragged her deeper into the house. Doors on either side opened on their own, and from each came the same whisper. "Tongue, tongue, Saha." Peppa ran to her parents' room and pushed the door open, desperate for safety. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, belongings carefully placed, as if her parents had never lived there. On the wall mirror, she saw not herself, but George. He stood motionless, his eyes hollow, his mouth moving, repeating the creature's words. Peppa stumbled back in horror. The mirror cracked, and George from the reflection stepped forward, trying to emerge. The girl screamed and bolted into the hall. Lights flickered everywhere, and each time they lit, the silhouette of Tung Tung Sahur appeared. Sometimes ahead of her, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside her. She burst into the living room. The television switched on by itself, showing only static, and from the speakers came the same melody. On the screen flashed her own face, twisted, foreign. Its lips moved, and it spoke. "You cannot escape." Peppa clamped her hooves over her ears, shut her eyes, pressed against the wall. But the sound only grew stronger. The air thickened around her, and every shadow in the room began to shift, stretching toward the center. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness. Its hands reached for Peppa, fingers too long, bent like hooks. It tilted its head, and its mouth split into a grin filled with alien, inhuman joy. "Tonight will not end," Tung Tung Sahur intoned. His voice echoed from the TV, from the mirror, from the shadows themselves. Peppa screamed, but her voice drowned in the roaring melody. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The world quaked around her, walls pulling apart and closing again, the ceiling rising higher, turning the house into an endless maze. The last thing she saw were the creature's burning red eyes. They loomed closer and closer until they filled her vision completely. And then came darkness, silence, and a whisper, faint but clear. "She's ours now." The morning began like any other. The sun slowly rose over the pig family's house, its rays passing through the green walls of the living room, leaving familiar shadows on the orange sofa. Daddy Pig had already turned on the TV, Mummy Pig was washing the dishes, and Peppa and George were just waking up. But something wasn't right. Peppa opened her eyes and immediately felt an unusual silence. The house seemed to have stopped breathing. The air was thick and heavy, like before a storm. There were no familiar sounds, no footsteps, no birds outside, only a distant humming, like a faint electric buzz. She sat up in bed. George was sleeping peacefully, but even his breathing sounded too steady, too artificial. Peppa stood up and walked to the door. The floor felt cold beneath her hooves, and every step echoed softly. The hallway looked familiar, but the light was strange, dull and cloudy, as if the walls were swallowing the sunlight. When she went downstairs, her heart froze. Her whole family was already sitting at the table. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George. Bowls of porridge sat in front of them, untouched. None of them moved. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Their eyes were wide open, gleaming with an unnatural light, and their smiles looked drawn on, too wide, too perfect. "Good morning," Peppa said quietly. No one replied. Daddy Pig slowly turned his head. The motion was sharp, jerky, like a puppet on a string. "Good morning, Peppa," he said in a flat, muffled tone. Peppa flinched. At that moment, the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showing static. The sound of white noise filled the room. Peppa stepped closer. The image began to clear. On the screen was her, but the reflection moved differently. It lagged behind slightly, then froze and suddenly waved. Peppa didn't move. The reflection smiled, first faintly, then wider and wider, until the mouth stretched too far, distorting the shape of her face. The TV hissed, and a distorted voice spoke backward. The words were garbled, but Peppa somehow felt it was speaking to her. She pressed the remote. Nothing happened. She changed the channels. All of them showed the same thing. Her face, smiling, silent. She backed away toward the table. Mummy Pig and George were now looking at her. Their smiles didn't fade. Their eyes moved in perfect unison, following her every step. George's toy dinosaur sat on the table. Its plastic eyes blinked. Peppa screamed and ran upstairs. The staircase seemed to stretch under her feet, her steps echoing louder than usual. The house repeated every sound, as if breathing with her. Her bedroom was dark, even though the sun still shone outside. Peppa approached the mirror. In the reflection stood herself, but not quite. Her fur looked darker, her eyes hollow, and her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. The reflection slowly placed its hooves against the glass from the inside. The surface fogged up, as if it were breathing. "Who are you?" Peppa whispered. No answer, only a faint crackling sound, like the TV's static, filled the room again. Peppa stepped closer. Her reflection copied the movement, slightly delayed, like a broken recording. And then, in perfect sync. Both Peppas pressed their hooves to the glass. For a moment, the house froze. Then a familiar voice echoed from below. "Peppa, breakfast's ready." She stumbled back. The room brightened. The laughter of her family floated up from downstairs, soft, cheerful. Everything looked normal again. Peppa took a deep breath, trying to convince herself it had all been a dream. She opened the door and went down. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and George were sitting at the table, smiling and lively. "Good morning, Peppa," they said together. Peppa sat down but didn't answer. There was something wrong with their voices. Too smooth, too even, as if they were speaking in rhythm. She glanced at the window. The sunlight shone as always, but her reflection moved a second later. And when Peppa blinked, the reflection didn't. It only smiled. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window. A second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees. Watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it all began with something small. Peppa woke up in her room and saw the sun shining through the window just like always. George was asleep beside her, lying on his side, hugging his dinosaur. Everything seemed ordinary. From downstairs came the familiar sounds. Mummy Pig making breakfast, Daddy Pig rustling his newspaper. Peppa went down, and on the table a bowl of porridge was waiting for her. But the porridge was cold. She tasted it. It had no flavor at all, no sweetness, no salt, just emptiness. Peppa frowned but said nothing. The day passed as usual. A walk in the garden, lunch, games with George, a bedtime story, and then sleep again. The next morning, everything repeated. George lay in the same position. Mummy cooked the same breakfast. Daddy held the newspaper in the same way. And again, the porridge was cold. Peppa thought it was déjà vu, but by the third day, it was clear. This was no coincidence. George said the same word, dinosaur. Her parents repeated the same phrases. The sun fell at the same angle, and everything followed the same script. On the fourth day, Peppa decided to test it. She didn't go down for breakfast, staying in her room instead. But nothing changed. Downstairs, the same voices continued. George said the same things. Her parents didn't notice her absence, as if it had already been written that way. "Mummy," Peppa asked cautiously, "what day is it today?" Mummy Pig looked at her and smiled, too wide. "Today is today." The words sounded hollow, like an echo. Time lost all meaning. Day after day, nothing changed. Only Peppa felt the growing unease. The walls began to seem alive. The windows glowed with a flat white light, as though they weren't showing the outside world at all but painted scenery. Doors led to the same rooms but at wrong angles, as if the house was folding and unfolding on itself. On the 7th day, Peppa woke up earlier than everyone else, or so it seemed. The room was dark, though the clock said it was morning. George lay beside her, his eyes wide open. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. But when Peppa called his name, he suddenly sat up, smiled too quickly, too perfectly, and said, "Today will be a good day, Peppa." And then he froze again. Fear gripped her. She hid under the blanket, but deep down she knew this wasn't her home anymore. Soon Daddy Pig vanished. His place at the table was empty, though the newspaper still lay on the chair. Then Mummy disappeared. Then George. No one noticed their absence. It was as if they had never existed. Only Peppa remembered. On the final day, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. What met her wasn't the world. The grass was painted flat on the ground. The trees were cardboard cutouts. The sky was nothing but a dull grey light, without sun or clouds. It all looked like a stage set. And then she heard it. A monotonous, distorted melody, like something played on a broken record. From around the corner of the house came Tralalelo Tralala. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the half-light. His mouth opened and closed, and each time that same strange tune spilled out. Tralalelo, tralala. The sound echoed through the empty world, bouncing off the walls of her mind. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if her feet were fused to the ground. Her thoughts grew heavy, blurred. The world around her shook, its lines smeared like wet paint. Then, among the cardboard trees, a figure appeared. Dancing, laughter pierced the grey sky, louder, sharper. It was Lirili Larilla. Her movements were graceful, spinning as if she was enjoying the nightmare. Her form broke apart into fragments, then reassembled, as if she didn't belong to this world at all. Peppa stood alone. The house behind her no longer looked like a home, but like another piece of scenery. The creatures closed in. Tralalelo Tralala stepped closer, his glowing red eyes burning brighter. Lirili Larilla's laughter rose, her silhouette trembling, about to reach out for Peppa herself. And at that moment, Peppa understood. This wasn't a dream, not déjà vu, not repetition. It was a game, their game, and she was next. That day, Peppa and her little sister Ivy were playing happily in their room. Peppa was building a tall tower with blocks, while Ivy, always a curious little one, was exploring every corner of the room. Suddenly, Ivy noticed something under Peppa's bed. She crawled over and pulled out a strange yellow toy with huge black eyes and sharp, realistic-looking teeth. The little one clapped her hands joyfully, hugging the find close to herself. Peppa was surprised. She had never seen this toy before. On the tag was written a strange name, Laboo. "Ivy, where did you get this toy?" "I've never seen it before," said Peppa, examining the strange creature. "What a weird name. And its teeth look so real." Despite the uneasy feeling, Peppa let Ivy play with the new toy. And then, something incredible happened. A second window appeared in the room, one that had never been there before. Behind this dark window stretched a gloomy forest with trees resembling the silhouettes of Laboo toys. "What is this? Where did this window come from?" exclaimed Peppa in shock. but Ivy seemed completely oblivious to the new window. She was entirely absorbed in playing with Laboo. Little Ivy pressed the toy to her ear as if listening to something very important. She smiled and nodded her head as if agreeing with something. "Ivy, who are you talking to?" asked the worried Peppa, but the little one just continued hugging the toy and smiling. When their mother entered the room, Peppa tried to tell her about the strange window and toy. "Mummy, look! A second window appeared in our room, and Ivy is talking to this strange toy," Peppa said excitedly, but their mother couldn't see anything. For her, there was only an ordinary wall, and Ivy was simply playing by herself. "You have quite an imagination, Peppa," said their mother, and left, unaware of the approaching danger. "But Mummy, it's right here!" cried Peppa, but it was useless. As night fell, events took an even more sinister turn. Peppa couldn't sleep, watching the dark window. Meanwhile, Ivy, hugging Laboo, began humming a strange, mesmerizing melody. The little one couldn't speak yet, but she hummed this tune as if she had known it her whole life. "Laboo, Laboo." "Ivy, what are you singing? How do you know this song?" asked Peppa fearfully, but Ivy just continued humming and rocking with the toy. Peppa looked at the second window and was horrified. Behind the glass, dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing. An entire army of Laboo toys was watching them from the dark forest. The next night, the most terrible thing happened. Peppa woke up to an unusual silence. Ivy's crib was empty. The Laboo toy had also disappeared. The second window was wide open, and in the forest, Peppa saw the retreating silhouette of her little sister. Ivy was walking, holding hands with a large figure that looked like Laboo. "Ivy, come back!" screamed Peppa, but it was too late. Ivy disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, and the window behind her closed and dissolved into the wall as if it had never existed. In the morning, their parents searched the entire house, the entire neighborhood, but Ivy was nowhere to be found. Mummy cried, Daddy called the police, and Peppa remained silent. She knew the truth, but who would believe her? A whole year passed. Peppa learned to live with this terrible secret. She played alone in her room, which now seemed too big and empty without Ivy's laughter. And then one day, while cleaning under her bed, Peppa found a small teddy bear. It was so cute and harmless. "What a lovely bear," smiled Peppa, picking it up. But as soon as she lifted the teddy bear, that same dark window appeared in the room again. Behind the glass stood Ivy. But this was no longer the cheerful little one that Peppa remembered. Ivy's skin had turned yellow, and her eyes were black, just like Laboo's. In her hands, she held that same cursed toy and slowly waved her hand. Although Ivy couldn't speak, Peppa seemed to hear her voice in her head. "Join us, big sister." Peppa dropped the teddy bear in horror. She realized that the nightmare was just beginning, and now Laboo had come for her. At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound, just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. Its waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. Only sometimes, he whispered, "Laboo is inside." He's watching. Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like Laboo, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again. But every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. In Peppa's room, there had always been one familiar window looking out onto the garden. But one morning, she noticed something new. On the wall beside her bed, there was now another window, narrow, with a cracked frame and dim, misted glass. It looked old, as if it had been there for many years, though it had never been there before. Peppa stepped closer. Beyond this window, there was no familiar yard or swings. Instead, a dark forest stretched out, wrapped in grey fog. Tall trees rose upward, their branches intertwining into black patterns. In the distance, among the trunks, stood a figure. It was motionless, yet in its outline, there was something alive. The next day, the figure was closer. Through the mist, Peppa could make out sharp ears, huge round eyes, and a smile too wide to be real. It was Laboo. His silhouette grew darker and clearer, and it seemed that each day he took another step closer to the window. Peppa tried to tell Mummy Pig, "Mummy, there's a new window in my room. There's a forest outside it, and someone is standing there." But as soon as Mummy walked into the room, the second window vanished. The wall was ordinary again. "You must have dreamed it, Peppa," Mummy Pig said, patting her daughter's head before leaving. That night, however, Peppa woke again to see the window had returned. In the fog, Laboo stood much closer. His eyes glowed yellow, and Peppa felt the cold from his gaze spread through the room. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, but still couldn't fall asleep. Each morning, the figure was nearer. On the third day, Laboo stood almost at the forest's edge, his long arms stretching forward as if trying to touch the glass. Peppa called her mother again, but the window disappeared the moment she entered. "Enough of this imagination," Mummy Pig said firmly. "There's nothing wrong in your room?" But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. On the fourth night, a strange sound woke her. From the window came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across glass. Terrified, Peppa watched as the shadowy figure in the mist lifted its head. Laboo was right there now. His glowing eyes stared directly at the level of her bed. In the morning, marks appeared on the glass of the second window, as though someone had scraped it with sharp nails. And at the bottom corner, words were etched, carved from the inside. "You look through the window, but I am inside." Peppa's heart sank. She ran to fetch her mother and tried to show her the writing, but when they returned, the window had vanished again. That night, Peppa didn't go to sleep. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the wall where the window would appear. When the clock hands passed midnight, it returned. Laboo was now standing directly behind the glass. His smile was wider than ever. He didn't move, but Peppa could clearly hear a whisper in her head. "Open the window. I'm waiting for you." She gripped the windowsill tightly, trying not to move. In the silence, she heard only her own breathing, shallow and uneven. Suddenly, the glass trembled slightly, as if someone was pressing against it from the forest side. Peppa screamed, and in that instant, everything vanished. The room was ordinary once more. Only a small, damp sprig of pine needles lay on the floor. Now, every morning, Peppa wondered if the second window would appear again, and every night, it did. Laboo was closer each time, and Peppa knew one day he would no longer remain behind the glass.